The whispers from the vents. Ben had always been skeptical of the supernatural. He didn't believe in ghosts, hauntings, or anything that couldn't be logically explained. So, when he found a cheap apartment in a rundown building, he didn't pay much attention to the rumors. His new place had a bit of a creepy vibe, sure, but it was affordable and close to work. Perfect, he thought. From the very first night, Ben noticed something strange. While lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, he could hear faint whispers coming through the vents. At first, he assumed it was his neighbors. But as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They weren't coming from the apartment next door, they were coming from the vent right above his bed. Sometimes, the voices sounded like they were arguing, other times they were just whispering his name softly, over and over. Ben dismissed it as his mind playing tricks on him, but the occurrences became impossible to ignore. The air in his apartment felt colder, and no matter how much he adjusted the thermostat, it always seemed to have an icy chill. More disturbing was the fact that objects began to move. He would find his phone in places he hadn't left it, doors that he'd closed would be open, and on several occasions, he'd return home to find the lights on when he distinctly remembered turning them off. One night, determined to put an end to his paranoia, Ben climbed a chair and peered into the vent above his bed. What he saw chilled him to the bone. Wedged inside the vent was an old, worn piece of cloth, darkened with age. It looked like part of a jacket. But it wasn't the cloth that terrified him, it was what was beneath it. A pair of eyes stared back at him. Ben jumped back, nearly falling off the chair, but when he looked again, the eyes were gone, replaced by nothing but darkness. Trembling, he convinced himself he had imagined it, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The next day, he spoke to his landlord about the strange occurrences. The landlord gave him an uneasy look and finally relented, telling Ben something he'd never heard before. Many years ago, there had been a tenant in Ben's apartment, a reclusive man who rarely left and was hardly seen by his neighbors. One day, the man simply vanished. The police conducted a search, but no trace of him was ever found. His disappearance was a mystery, and over time, the building fell into disrepair, and the incident was forgotten. But some tenants had whispered about strange sounds from the vents ever since. That night, the whispers returned, more insistent and clearer than ever. Ben couldn't sleep, the eerie voices keeping him awake. It sounded like someone was calling for help, pleading from inside the walls. Terrified, Ben tried to ignore the sounds, pulling the covers over his head and praying for morning to come. But just as he was about to fall asleep, the vent above him creaked open. Slowly, a long, pale arm began to stretch out of the darkness, reaching for him. It was thin and bony, with fingers that looked too long to be human. Frozen in fear, Ben couldn't move as the arm came closer, its fingers brushing against his blanket. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he leapt from his bed and ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. Ben never returned. The landlord found the apartment empty the next day, save for a few scattered belongings and the vent wide open, as if something, or someone, had crawled out. To this day, new tenants of the apartment often complain of hearing whispers from the vents. Some say, late at night, they hear scratching, like fingers dragging along the metal. Others claim to have seen eyes staring back at them from the dark. But no one has ever lasted long enough to find out who, or what, was still trapped in the vents.